This is Chris, the Idaho Cyclist, bringing you another how-to video on how to operate and maintain your bicycle. This is Chris. In this video, we're going to show you how to remove a Sram or Shimano lock ring. And in this task, we've got three tools that we're going to be using. We're going to be using what we call a chain whip. We're going to be using a large crescent wrench, and then we're going to be using a Park Tools FR5 lock ring removal tool. And to start off this task, we've got our wheel here, and it's got our free hub body and cassette on it right here. And we're going to take and remove our skewer. So we're going to unscrew the small skewer nut. We're going to pull off this cone-shaped spring, and make note that spring goes, the small portion of the spring goes on first. So we're going to pull that off, and I always put my spring back on my skewer, put my nut back on, and we're going to set my skewer aside. Prior to putting that skewer back on, you want to put a little bit of grease on the skewer before sliding it back on. Now we've got our free hub body exposed with our cassette right here. And we're going to take, if you take your actual FR5 Park Tool lock ring removal tool, if you go to attempt to unloosen the nut, the free hub body spins, and that's where we'll be using our chain whip. So I take my chain whip, and you can set your wheel on a bench. You can lie it flat on the ground if that's convenient, whatever works for you. I like to set it on the ground, but for the video, I'm going to show you how to remove it with it sitting up here on this bench. So I'm going to take my chain whip. I'm going to wrap the chain whip around the cassette body and get it to where I can feel it engaged. And then once I feel it engaged and tight on the cassette body, I'm going to use my hand and then just grip onto one of the spokes or a couple of the spokes just to keep that thing tight. Now I'm going to take my crescent wrench, get that ready. I'm going to take the lock ring tool, and we're just going to slide it, and it goes right inside the splines. It's going to set right inside there. So I'm going to set that down, and I'm going to take my crescent wrench. Now get my crescent wrench engaged on the lock ring tool, and now set right here. I'm going to get my crescent wrench engaged, and to actually remove this lock ring, you're going to want to push down, and you're going to remove it by turning it counterclockwise or pushing down. So I'm going to just push down, and now it's loosened up. You can feel it loosen up. If you got to set it down on the ground because it's on there really tight, to get a little more torque, set it down on the ground. But now it's just going to turn counterclockwise. The lock ring is going to come out, and that lock ring has a very thin washer on there. You don't want that washer. Usually it's on there and it won't come off, but you want to make sure you don't lose that. I can take my chain whip off now, set my chain whip aside. Make sure you don't turn your free hub body down or your wheel over, because your actual cassette will actually fall off. This cassette is now loose. So I want to keep this cassette and the wheel flat, and then I'll just take and slide this cassette body off. I'm going to set that cassette body down on a bench someplace, and then now I've got my wheel and free hub and body exposed. You're going to notice a spacer. This is an actual Shimano spacer, because I got a Shimano cassette and a Shimano free hub body. This spacer should always stay with your cassette. I'm going to slide this back on. Make sure you don't lose that spacer. Now I got my cassette body removed, and you can start to pull the cassette body apart and make note of where each item goes. So when you go to put it back together, you know exactly how to put it back together. I removed the next largest one, and you can see there's a spacer in between that one. When you start to get down to some of the smaller teeth, you're going to see they actually got the spacers built on to these on this actual cassette body. All your cassette bodies are different. Shram's a little bit different. A Dura-Ace cassette body is a little bit different than this one. This is an Ultegra cassette body right here, so it's a little bit different than a Dura-Ace. So just make note how that cassette body comes apart, so you can actually reinstall it correctly. It's very difficult to reinstall the cassette body incorrectly, because there's got splines in them, notches. There's a large knot that corresponds with the free hub body, and it will only slide on one direction, and that's when you get that large portion groove of the cassette body lined up with the large portion on the ring itself. If you try to flip it over backwards, it's impossible. It won't slide on backwards because there's a small groove next to the large groove that corresponds only if it's right side up. And then you'll begin the process putting your cassette back together just like you actually took it off. When you actually go to tighten up your lock ring, you don't actually have to have the chain whip because the free hub body now locks go in the opposite direction. So when you crank your crescent wrench, it'll actually tighten. Now I've got my cassette body stacked back on here correctly and ready to put my lock ring back on. I got my lock ring right here, the washer's installed. I'm going to set that lock ring right where it goes. I'm going to take my lock ring tool and just thread that on there, just like that. Get it hand tight. And now when you reinstall and retightening this, you don't actually have to have a chain whip because now the free body doesn't spin the opposite direction. So now we're going to tighten it, going in a clockwise motion, and you can feel it tighten it, and it actually has kind of a bumping motion as it tightens. I'm going to get it up and just make it good and snug. Set that aside, and now you're just going to reinstall your skewer. Take unthread your skewer. The cam side is going to go the opposite of your cassette body. I'm going to slide that in there. The small portion of the cone is going to slide on first. Prior to actually putting on the skewers, it's a good idea to just put a little bit of grease on the skewer itself. Slide the skewer in. Put your cone spring back on. Screw on your nut. And now your cassette body is reinstalled properly. This is Chris, the Idaho Cyclist, bringing you another how-to video. We've got the cassette body removed now, and just to take a closer look at it, we're going to pull this cassette body apart, and as you pull apart each step, you're going to see here we got a spacer in between that one, there's a spacer in between this one, and you just want to make note of how this cassette body comes apart. On this cassette body I've got two spacers. Here's a spacer here, here's a spacer here. This one is actually, these are two that are actually hooked together. These are ones that are actually got built-in spacers on them. And every cassette body is actually a little bit different. Your Dura Ace one's going to be a little bit different, made out of some different materials, titanium. Here's a close look at the large portion right here of the ring that actually will correspond to your free hub body that will slide on the free hub body. Here's a close look at our Park Tools FR5 lock ring tool. Here's a close look at the lock ring itself. And then this is the actual Shimano spacer. Very important to reinstall this spacer first before you put the cassette body on. Here's a close look at what our chain whip tool looks like. Look at this cassette body. If you rotate this cassette body around, you're going to see here we got our large groove right here, and this is the large groove that's going to correspond with the large notch on your actual rings from your cassette body. And if you keep spinning around, you're going to see they all are fairly equal. You got this large one, and then the distance between the right side and the left side of the large is different. That way you cannot put your rings on backwards, which would cause some shipping issues. Make note, behind your cassette is a spacer. If you're using Shimano, there's a Shimano spacer. You don't want to lose that spacer. That spacer goes on the free hub body first, and then your cassette is installed. If you got a Mavic wheel, a Mavic style wheel, you're going to have a Shimano, because this actual spacer always goes with your cassette body. If you have a Mavic wheel, it also has a spacer that actually stays with the wheel itself, so you'll have two spacers. If you forget to put this spacer in, the cassette's not going to tighten down properly and you're going to have bad shifting. Remove right off the freewheel body. And now you got your cassette, and you want to, as you pull your cassette apart, make note of the cassette itself and the spacers and where the spacers go. Pretty difficult to put the cassette back wrong. It's, you know, it starts from the smallest chain ring on up, and it's going to go, and eventually you're going to see the spacers in between. The smallest ones have built-on spacers. Eventually, when you work yourself up to the last four, they're actually hooked together and they've got spacers in between them. When you get ready to put back your freewheel body back on your cassette, back on your freewheel body, you're going to take cassette back on the freewheel body. Make sure the freewheel body has a spacer. This is actual a Shimano spacer. I've got a Shimano cassette on. Make sure that Shimano spacer goes back on. And then the freewheel body, if you look at the spaces in between the freewheel body, there's going to be one space that's actually larger than the rest of the space as you look at these lines. And that one space, large space, is going to correspond to a large groove in space in your chain ring. And you'll see as you walk that around and find that large space, it will slide right down on there just like that. And it's pretty hard to put it back together wrong. So you're just going to go take the next one, find the large space on the chain ring, and slide it up. And if you try to put it on upside down, it actually doesn't correspond to the teeth. It's impossible to actually put it upside down. And you'll see that as you're trying to put it back together. Put a spacer, next largest ring, stick the next largest ring on, put another spacer, next largest ring, and then my next three rings don't have spacers, they're built-on spacers, so slide that on, next largest one, just slide that one on, and the next largest one, slide the last one, this is the very last one, get that one in place, and now we'll go about putting the Shimano Lockring back